fly with me Blidworth to Borneo. Blidworth is a small mining village in the county of Nottinghamshire, Robin Hood country, as we mentioned earlier on. And I know this is a big saying in America, is live the dream. I live the dream, and I'm going to take you on the first part of it. So here we go. The journey is from the Blidworth mining village to the Borneo Dayak village, and lots of people in between. But let me tell you first of all about what we call a postcode lottery over in this country, which happened in the 1950s. And this was really a lottery because in Nottinghamshire, where I was brought up, only the top 10% of kids could go to grammar school. That's all they'd got room for. Whereas in Cornwall, at the other end of the country, in the southwest, it was 35%. So we had the smallest percentage, but I was one of the lucky ones and was the only boy in the village to pass. And it took me away from my little village to school in a place called Mansfield, Queen Elizabeth Boys Grammar School. Pity that it was only boys, but 500 of us, and that dated back to Queen Elizabeth the first time. But when I joined there, I, within 2 years, joined the Air Training Corps, which was a gateway to a different life and allowed me to mix with people whose parents didn't have to go a mile underground to make money. And my maiden flight during the time in the ATC was in a Vickers Varsity and in a gorgeous place over the Yorkshire Moors, the North Yorkshire Moors. And I know a lot of people that come over here from America are surprised how much open land we have, but we really have some beautiful parts. That flight actually cost me £0.50, which at the time was the equivalent of $0.50. You'll notice that I've been clever enough to pick that coin there that was minted on the year that I was born. Anyway, it cost me that £0.50, but not to fly, to clean up the sick that I'd done on the aeroplane. And that was the first, last and only time I've been sick in flight. And I understand that the pilot, a gentleman called Master Pilot Penchek, threatened never to take any more ATC people after that, although I believe that he did relent. Excuse me. But just to show that I could fly without being sick, the next day I actually had controls of a tiger moth, and somebody mentioned a biplane earlier on. And so I think they said they'd either flown one or flown in one, but I had the controls of this and managed not to be sick. But there we are. I had a career choice, £15 a week, which was a lot of money in those days, to go down the mines, or £3 a week to join the RAF. I guess one of the things that influenced me was that my father told me he would kill me if I went down the mines, and I didn't fancy being killed, so decided to join the RAF instead, and managed it on January 1956 at the ripe old age of 18 years and 3 days. And that is me when I was young and slim and thin at the time, and still had the big ears, though, you notice. But this was my home for a while, where I did my basic training, which was hard, really hard. Let's not kid ourselves. It was tough, and this was our billet that we sat around the coke stove there, because it was the end of January, February, and there was snow on the ground, so it was pretty cold outside, and we would gather around there to clean all of our kit. There were tough parts. On the left you can see the training, and proud parts, and I sympathized with the drill instructors. They had 2 months to turn boys into men, and bullied us in many, many ways. But I suppose everybody that I've met that did the service training, and national service was around at that time, then they look back on it with pleasant memories. But I guess that's because we forget some of the nasty parts. But hey, I had to decide what to be. And there's a little story about this that couldn't happen today. When I first left school, I applied for a job with a solicitor to become a slave to him, so use the word slave. But unfortunately, lost the job because of the princessum of 10 shillings, which is, I guess, about 50 cents today, because he could take on a girl for that price less than me. It would be discrimination in this day and age, but hey. Anyway, my first flight in the RAF was from a place called Blackbush, and I took off from there, and my first landing was in Nice in the south of France, and we were allowed off the aeroplane because it took 2 refuelings to get there. So that's the first time I stepped on foreign soil. I hadn't even been in Wales, Scotland or Ireland that time. And then a couple of hours later in Italy, where the young lady said that she came from, destination Naples. And they say, see Naples and die. And as she will know, die is a little place not far away, not that you would pass away, excuse me. And then eventually arrived in Malta on May the 7th, 1956. The date sticks with me because it was raining, and the next time I saw any rain was September the 13th. For those of you that don't know Malta, it's basically 3 larger islands and a few small ones. Malta, the large ones are Malta itself, Gozo, which is up there, and Camino, the little one in between. And it was about the size of Greater London, which is 95 square miles, so not a huge place, but very historical and with a fantastic Mediterranean climate and a superb history. George Bernard Shaw, that famous Irishman, described it as the island of bells, smells and pregnant women to which he would never return. He was right about the bells, lots and lots of churches, and smells, of course there were, and pregnant women galore, because it was a Catholic country and contraception was illegal. But he had some beautiful places. There is Medina, a one-time capital that was known as, and is known as, the Silent City. And sure enough, if you're within the walls, you can hear hardly anything. I think, unfortunately, one of the reasons is that the Maltese today still shoot some of the small birds that stop there on the way back to North Africa, and it stops the twittering. This is Valletta, the capital, extremely historical. And of course, you'll remember that we're talking about a time only 11 years after the end of the war, so it was still scarred with lots of bombing from the Germans, and Malta won the George Cross for its bravery. This man, Benjamin Disraeli, still our only Jewish prime minister, who described Valletta as a city of palaces built by gentlemen for gentlemen. But Disraeli himself was a bit of a snob and once said, when I want to read a good book, I write one. I wanted to do Moster Dome, which is, I think, the 3rd largest dome in Europe. And this, during the war, was struck by a German bomb, but thankfully it didn't pierce the roof, which is extremely thick, and also didn't explode, thankfully protecting the 300 and so people inside at the time. There was lots of nice bays. This is Paradise Bay. This one at the time was called Military Bay, which has changed its name now because we're no longer there. But I want to talk to you with a little story about this particular one, which is very famous. It's the Blue Lagoon and the Blue Grotto. And a giant chap that made it even more famous was an actor called James Coombs. I'm not sure if you have Cadbury's milk tray in America, but you certainly have boxes of chocolate, because I know many are fond of it. But Cadbury's had an advertisement with the guy dressed in black diving off that cliff there into shark-infested waters, more about that later, to place a box of chocolates on the pillow of a lady that was asleep in a boat. When the director asked them to take it, and of course Coombs himself didn't do the dive, but they had a Maltese professional diver as a stand-in. But he did an absolute perfect take. But the director said, well, just to make sure, let's have one take and try it again. So the Maltese guy flung himself into the air from there, into the water, and broke both his arms. But this is the entrance to the camp that was my home, RAF Luca, That's the main gate. And this is the accommodation block. Very much like a lot of the European package tour holiday places now, and that was facing west. So to me, it was absolutely paradise, and actually quite modern for the time, complete with our showers and everything. And I got a new uniform. I'm showing this picture to show the uniform, plus the fact I had hair that I no longer have. It's disappeared, but you'll notice the ears were still there, because for 6 months of the year we wore khaki drill and the blue serge for the remainder of the time. I don't know if I've got anyone there that's been in a place where you change, but always it seemed inevitable that at the end of September the weather would turn cold and we'd be glad to change into our blue serge, and then it would immediately get warm again when we were too warm. But I guess that's nature telling us that she's in charge. I had my own personal transport. This is not the actual one, but a replica of it, my own sit up and beg bicycle, because I was sighted about 1.5 miles away from the site where it all happened. But our senior and junior services, that's the Navy and the RAF, dominated Malta at that time, and there were over 30,000 of us stationed there. So that obviously did a lot for the economy. This was Luca Airfield, where I was based, and that's a picture taken just a year after I left. And we had Meteors, which were the very first jet fighters, which actually flew just before the end of the Second World War. And just to show you one or two of the other airplanes there, this is a Bristol Beverley. God knows how that used to get off the ground, because that could carry tanks and all sorts. But I suppose when we look at today's jumbo jets, that's not surprising either. But this is one of my favourites, the Sunderland Seaplane, that was actually commissioned by the British Royal Mail, because they wanted to guarantee airmail to every part of the world. And of course, runways are very expensive to build. So they commissioned Short Brothers to build a seaplane, which would land on the 2/3 of the world that's under water. This is an Avro Shackleton that was a marine reconnaissance plane and could fly 50 feet above the ground. But I used to scrounge flights on that, lifts on that, for survey, for jollies, they call them. And this is a picture of the Mediterranean fleet, which was huge, and the place was packed out with matelots, as we friendly call them, when the British fleet would come out once a year to join them. Excuse me, have a swig. But just to give you an idea of numbers, this is one of our aircraft carriers that had a crew of 2,640. I want to talk about Whitehall Mansions, because although the RAF didn't have women serving over there, the Royal Navy did, and there were 300 Wrens that were based in Malta from just after the First World War. Not the same 300, they changed them regularly, so they weren't all 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. But they had a lovely system there where you could phone up and actually book a date. And the Wrens were very popular, because if you think about it, 30,000 men and only 300 girls. So they were heavily outnumbered and could take the pick. But I suppose that although I thought myself as being young and good looking, it didn't matter, because you phoned and made a blind date on the phone. But I did participate. The milk in Malta, I want to show you these, because the Maltese goats, the milk is actually goat's milk as opposed to cow's milk. I don't know about America if you get milk delivered, but we certainly used to get milk delivered to the door before supermarkets. And in Malta, even though it was goat's milk, they did the same thing. And I'd like to introduce you to the Maltese milk delivery man. There you are. Very good. And so everybody got, I guess, either the goat or the man were very accurate if they could hit that small container. But back to taking the Wren out, you couldn't take her on the back of a bicycle. So I actually invested in my first car, this one here, Morris 8, not that particular one, that's a replica, but it was a 1934 model, and a bit interesting because it was the very first one that had hydraulic foot brakes. and the version that I bought had a leaky main cylinder, so occasionally the foot brake wouldn't work. I had to engine change and yank up the handbrake to stop it. And once the handbrake cable broke, as I was on the brow of a hill, so I had to turn it into a stone wall, which it bounced off. I didn't think it more damage to the wall than the car, because they made them good in those days. This Austin 7 here, I'm showing you because a friend of mine had one of those, and we used to swap and take turns to drive each other's cars. But we had time off, of course, and this is a place called Straight Street in Valletta, which was the centre of entertainment. And there we see a couple of the bars, Lord Nelson and Bing Crosby. And to my knowledge, neither of those gentlemen ever went to those bars, but the whole street was just row after row of bars. The most famous one, Dick's Bar, called Dirty Dick's Bar, and anybody that's visited Malta in the service areas, and many that haven't, know that to be infamous. And you would go into bars and there'd be music and singing and dancing, and girls would come along and sit with you in exchange for a drink. And they would ask for a special drink, which really was coloured water and cost 2 shillings a shot, as opposed to 1 shilling for a bottle of beer. On this particular evening, then the lady came and said she'd sit with me if I would buy her a drink. I said, okay, only if you drink whiskey. And her reply was, no, we must have this special drink of ours. Okay, you'll do without the drink. All right, she said, I'll drink whiskey if you will drink whiskey. Well, always one for a challenge, so I did. 6 whiskies later, I crawled out of the bar and she was still prepared to carry on. However, you can see that coloured water at 2 shillings. We were on a pub crawl and walked down a few more pubs. I think I'd switched to Coke to sober up a bit. But on the way back, there was a small crowd outside the bar that we'd been in, and about 5 Maltese guys shouting and bawling at this young lady. And of course, I couldn't tell what they were saying, but I could tell when one lashed out and swung at her, and I stepped in and knocked him down, only to be followed to the floor myself and kicked loads out and ribs, and finished up in hospital, looked after by the Queen Alexandra nurses. And that was my reward for helping a damsel in distress. The next tale is a fishy tale, because the great white shark arrived in Malta. Now, until that time, only one person had ever been killed. Ironically enough, your country has had most deaths caused by the great white, although there's been more incidents in Australia. Anyway, this young student was out swimming and with his tutor next to him, and suddenly the student found himself being lifted up, and when he dropped back into the Mediterranean, it was red, and he realized it was the blood of his teacher who'd been gobbled up by the shark. The next day, because the Maltese government gave a reward, lots of little boats set out, and at the end of the day, there was 8 sharks hung up in Valletta on display. One of them, at least, was a basking shark, as you saw there. But I guess when you're catching a shark, you don't ask it what kind it is. You just bring it in, particularly if there's a reward. But my next problem was I had a tattoo to show my love for a young lady and caught yellow jaundice, which was quite dangerous out there. So back to hospital again, this time for 5 weeks. I talked about Shackleton training flights, and what the crews used to do there was put booze on board that they bought at duty-free prices and fly somewhere and given an incorrect estimated time of arrival. So in fact, we were smuggling. And I managed to go on one of those trips to El Adam in North Africa to do some grocery shopping as well. And we got back in time to take away all our whiskey, gin and whatever before the customs people turned up. And speaking of booze, the late Queen Mother there, I had the honour of meeting even. She turned up in what we call the Whispering Giant, which is a Britannia aeroplane. And I was fortunate to be on the guard of honour, and actually was allowed to say 2 words to her. When she asked me where I was from in the UK, I was allowed to say Nottingham, ma'am. But I tell people now, I, of course, met the Queen Mother, you know. But these two people caused a bit of a conflict when I was there. On the left is Anthony Eden, Prime Minister of England at the time, and on the right, Colonel Nasser, who was President of Egypt. And what had happened is that your country, the Americans and ourselves, had promised to fund a dam that Egypt wanted to build so there were fresh water. And you can see, for those of you who know, don't know it, how shorter the journey from the Far East to the UK was, on Europe, through the Suez Canal. Anyway, he wanted the money for the dam, and we promised to give it to him. Ourselves and you were meeting the cost. At the same time, he said he wanted to buy some arms and ammunition from us because he was feared his neighbours Israel. And we refused to supply him with those. So, not surprisingly, he went to Russia, who welcomed him with open arms, at which time we both reneged, that's you and us, on our deal to fund the dam. So he was desperate to get the money, so nationalised the Suez Canal, which was actually partially owned by ourselves. And he said he would raise the money by charging an entry fee to go through. Not surprisingly, we wanted to keep the canal open, and we invaded, and there were the soldiers on the way, and these were the two bombers that were based on my camp, and they were taken off every 2 minutes. The war didn't last long, about 7 days, and I think it was America that pulled us and the French out of it. But when you look, things, they say history is written by the winners, but he was pushed into a corner, although I don't want to get into that particular argument. But hey, destination Gibraltar, managed to go there as well. As you can imagine, still living the dream. And I met two of the locals there, the Barbary Eights. And one of them was very kind and actually posed on my shoulder for a photograph to be taken. But the warm, wet liquid that flowed down my back wasn't local red wine, so I'll leave you to guess what it was. But hey, back to the UK very quickly, just for a very short period of time, because this is about comply with me, of course, but time to do something. I was based at a camp that was mostly underground. It was an intelligence place, and it was actually closing down. So I won't dwell on that too much, but there was time for learning, and the RAF sent me to Bristol University and the University of Hull and our own training college to become highly qualified in my trade as an accountant. It was also time for a couple of promotions, and I got made, first of all, a junior technician and then a substantive corporal. And it was also time for near disaster, when I realized I'd made the right choice, because my father, who drove a cutting machine, one day he was driving it underground, a mile underground, I mentioned, and instead of hitting coal, one of the picks hit granite, flew the machine back on him, ripped all the skin off his back and fractured his pelvis. And the doctor said if it had been a stone heavier, it would have killed him. 6 weeks later, bless him, he was back at work. But I really saw why he talked me out of going down the mine. Not that I needed much talking. But off I went again, and this time destination Singapore. And for people who don't know where it is, it's at the tip of the Malaysian peninsula there, as you can see. And a quite small island, but very, very cosmopolitan, and many, many different cultures. Fantastic experience. There's Tiger Balm Gardens in the night, and they have a place called Boogie Street, which is the equivalent of Straight Street in Malta, I guess. But that's where I'm allowed to say lady boys gather and show off their beauty. And you can tell the lady boys, they're a lot prettier than a lot of the girls, although I have to say that the Malaysian and Eastern girls are very pretty anyway. I'm allowed to say that in this day and age. I had my first gin sling in the world famous Raffles Hotel in the 1960s. And we had terrific facilities there, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and in the village there were lots of eating houses. And I talk about teapots because the British, wherever we go, or certainly used to, would only allow people to drink until 3 in the afternoon. We now have longer than that over here. But in the afternoon, you could still get a drink, but you get your whiskey or beer served in a teapot. But the next destination was Temalo, up the central Malaya in a place called Pahang, which is the largest state there, and the Pahang River flows through it. Fantastic lush vegetation, and there's a picture of a bat cave that I went to see. They're saying that that's where COVID started in China, aren't they? But I don't know. But this little guy here was a small wild boar that was tied to a bush as python bait. And unfortunately for him, some of our guys were out wandering and looked through the jungle, found him, released him, and we actually flew him back to Singapore. Just a story about a python. One time later, I was on guard looking after the money and locked in a room, woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning to find a python wrapped around the ventilation thing. I promise you, I locked in, and although I had a 303 rifle and ammunition, I didn't go back to sleep until 8 o'clock, well, at all, and I couldn't contact anybody until 8 o'clock. But again, up at Temalo, we'd only been there less than 24 hours, and a guy turned up and said he wanted to take some of us off to see the movies. So we actually managed to scrounge a truck from the RAF, and when we followed his vehicle, found that the cinema was actually in the middle of a rubber plantation, and the screen was stretched across between two trees. So what would be showing? Bound to be something racy, would you think? Of course it was, a raunchy movie, Gone with the Wind. And ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that, you believe anything. But I want to tell you now a place called Kuala Lumpur, and I went up there. We had a 36-hour pass, and that's further up the river than Temalo, but again, still on the Pahang, where they have loads and loads and loads of houseboats. The guy that I went up there with, and Kuala Lumpur has about 26,000 population, and we were the only two white people in town that weekend that I saw. And this guy had spent 12 years in the Malay police, so was fluent in Malay and appreciated the food out there, and took me out to, I guess, what was one of the most magnificent multicultural meals I've had in my life. But I'd not been out there very long and not accustomed to the taste, which is a horrible confession to make, although I can eat anything now. So I didn't like it and had to ask anything English, and got served with an omelette. Will this do? I think the chef threatened to commit suicide because I'd insulted his cooking. But because it was Muslim, there was no alcohol in the restaurant, and the only alcohol we could find, I don't know if you get Guinness over in your country, I'm sure you do, with the number of Irish Americans that are there, and that was the only thing we could find. We found this little shop with tables and chairs outside, and this guy had got 24 bottles of Guinness. We told him to put them in the fridge. When he said how many, we said the lot, and proceeded to drink them all. Not quite, because suddenly, out of the blue, we'd got two young ladies with us. Still no English. Well, I guess I'd got used to that, but sometimes you have to make allowances, don't you? The next destination was a place called Penang, which again is even further north. And I was there because I was attached to the Australian Air Force to the auditing of their accounts. And Penang is gorgeous and very famous, and got a railway that takes you up the very large mountain in the middle of the island, and the railway takes you above the clouds. I was based at RAF Butterworth, and we came up with the idea there that it would be a good idea to travel from Butterworth to Singapore by rail. Not on that particular time, but a few weeks later, we actually ran a relay, all that distance there, 530 miles, to celebrate the 45th anniversary of the RAF. But I saw then why we'd been on the exercise in Malaya, because I was posted out to Borneo when the little known war between Indonesia and ourselves broke out. So I had to set out the whole accounting system, including paying for all the guys, and there were over 2,000 under canvas, There was a war, as you can see on the left, and we were 20 miles from the front. But between me and the front and those 20 miles with thick jungle, I had the Gurkhas. And I would recommend, if you're ever in that situation, the best people to have between you and the enemy are the Gurkhas, terrific at jungle warfare. I put this is a Dayak village because we had a day in a Dayak village, a day at the races, went to see a show, the Mikado, and I had my own taxi because I had to go into town once a week. And this is a little story because I mentioned I had to do all the accounting. I had to get all the food provided. Realistically, there was only one company large enough to do that. But because we're an active service, I could only do a contract for a week at a time. So I'd borrow a Land Rover, drive in, and these two guys, Ting and Ting, would invite me in. And in the corner of the restaurant there, not the restaurant, the supermarket, they had a small bar and would insist I join them in the bar where we would carry out the signing. And they're very hospitable, insisted I had an alcoholic drink, and they got most upset when I refused. And of course, you don't want to upset the hospitality. So every Friday morning I would drive there. Every Friday morning I would give in to the temptation to go in the bar. And every Friday lunchtime, I would drive back very slowly, much the worse for wear. But these things happen, looking here, as if by magic, although we're on active service, suddenly football boots and things, soccer in your country appeared. And I was fortunate to captain the RAF Borneo team against the Army Borneo team. And we won. I had lunch with the governor of Sarawak. The lady that introduced mentioned that. And as it happened, he was the very last governor of Sarawak because they got independence shortly later. And I felt a bit guilty taking my GSM medal, but didn't turn it down. Just one little tale. When I got back, I was sent away for a month to sort out the accounts in an outlying unit. And I had got a young girlfriend left at Changi. And of course, I'd not seen her for a long time anyway. So managed to borrow this something like this, which is a 1948 Studebaker. And I'm sure that they were designed for the drive-in movies in your country. However, we'd parked by a beach just to have a little talk, of course, and could hear people chattering and thought we'd been spied on. So finished up in Kampong for a bit more privacy. She got a bit active on the front seat, and unfortunately, we managed to snap, one of us, the gear lever. So I could only get third and fourth gear, had to rev like hell, getting the car to move that just with third gear, and made a hell of a noise, frightening all the chickens and goats and everything. Lights came on, but we managed to make our escape. But I came back to the UK in the very first jet airliner, which is a de Havilland Comet that was later, of course, taken over and beaten by your people over there. And my mind's just gone blank, but of course it was Boeing that became the bosses of the skies. But I did full circle because I was posted back to the unit where I'd made my very first flight and been sick, and managed to scrounge a lift across to Germany in a varsity. And the place where we went was Wildenrath, a bit boring and nothing going on. So the guy that I'd gone on the trip with and I went across to Amsterdam, just out of curiosity, of course, to have a look what went on. The trip backfired a little bit because I'd actually travelled on my RAF identity card, which was valid in any country that we happened to be in, but of course not Holland. So when I got back to the border, I was held up for 2 hours, missed a train, and only just caught the flight back in time. The guy that was with me was laughing because he had a passport, but then his laughter turned to gloom when he realized that it was out of date. So he had to wait with me. But as I say, we both got back. So there we are. But it was time for a career change, and I'm looking at the time and I seem to have overrun. So it's goodbye RAF and hello Civvy Street. But all my qualifications, and I was as highly qualified as I could be, and I'd run the budget for the Far East Air Force. I'd set up the whole accounting system for an active service camp. I'd audited the accounts for the Royal Australian Air Force. So the Chartered Institute of Accountants told me I would have to start again as an accounts clerk. No way, sunshine. So career change, a new uniform, bowler hat, white shirt, tie, dark suit, because you have to dress like that to sell baked beans. Yep, I started my career as a salesman for Heinz, the baked bean people from headquarters, not too far away from you in Pittsburgh, but that's another story, which is Let Me Fly Again, which covers America, Cyprus, France, etc., etc., etc. So maybe next time you'll hear another part of my, what I think is interesting life. Meanwhile, any questions, and I will stop sharing my screen so that you can wave your hand or talk to me or whatever. Somebody's waving already.
Between the Mars 8 and the Austin 7, it raises a question in my mind: which side of the road did you drive on, because they were opposite?
No, we drove on the same. Malta is the same side as it. You know, a big chunk of the world drives on the same side as we do, including Japan and all the ex-Commonwealth countries. I think you lot do it just a bit bloody different.
Well, the two automobiles we pictured had to drive on opposite sides.
Yeah. But no, in Malta and in Singapore, it was on the same side. I've driven in America, of course, throughout a big journey through Florida, and yeah, it is different. And of course, most of Europe, we drive, or they drive on the opposite side.
Yeah. Very exciting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
I have to say, John, I agree with you. I've spent time in England and Europe, and I think we as Americans drive on the wrong side of the road. I have to tell you that I have never had such a pleasant driving experience as when I was in Europe and I was driving on what we think is the wrong side of the road. I loved it. I think we're all doing it wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I think we'll probably end our meeting here on a high note. I hope everybody has a good week. Thanks again, John. All right, bye, everyone.
Hi, thank